The issue of Crimea has become an important one in the context of European politics after the incident in 2014, when Crimea was annexed by Russia and the Ukrainian authorities lost control of the peninsula. However, the issue of Crimea's ownership was raised long before that and was quite actively discussed during the collapse of the Soviet Union and then in the early 90s. And in this video, we will talk about how it happened that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Crimea remained behind Ukraine and what attempts were made to separate it back then. Crimea became part of Ukraine in 1954. Usually, this event is associated with Khrushchev. As a rule, the reason for this is called the close economic connection of Crimea with Ukraine. Also, there are other reasons. I have a separate video about this. It's worth noting that at the time of the transfer of Crimea, it had the status of a region. The autonomous republic was liquidated with the deportation of Crimean Tatars in 1944. So, going back to the times of the late Soviet Union, the issue of Crimea began to rise again during Perestroika. The Soviet government recognized its position regarding the expulsion of the Crimean Tatars and the liquidation of the autonomous republic. Therefore, it decided to raise the issue of its restoration again. Thus, on January 20, 1991, a referendum was held on the restoration of the Crimean Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. The majority of the population voted for the restoration of the republic, namely 93% of the population of Crimea. By the way, this was the first referendum in the Soviet Union. The referendum itself did not raise the issue of Crimea's ownership. That means that the recreated Crimean Autonomous Republic remained part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. However, various political groups began to raise the issue of Crimea's ownership or republican status. They considered other possible options for the future fate of the Crimea. Some politicians advocated raising the status of Crimea from an autonomous republic on a par with the other Soviet republics, putting Crimea on a par with Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and so on. Similar ideas were popular in other autonomous republics at that time. However, the Soviet government opposed such initiatives, which could only give rise to additional separatism. The issue of the transfer of Crimea back to the RSFSR on the basis of the restoration of the Crimean autonomy, which was previously included there, was considered. The argument for the return of Crimea will be questions about the illegal transfer of Crimea in 1954 and the desire of local residents to transfer to Ukraine, as well as the fact that the Soviet authorities did not hold a referendum there back in 1954. At that time, referendums in the Soviet Union had not yet been held. However, this option was also not considered. Crimean Tatar nationalist organizations generally advocated the creation of the Crimean Tatar national autonomy. They did not recognize the results of the referendum, since the fate of the Crimean Tatar people should be decided only by them, and not by the entire population of Crimea. Thus, they relied on international law regarding self-determination. However, despite all these proposals, during the existence of the Union, they were not so massively supported, and the Crimean Autonomous Republic remained part of Ukraine. In September 1991, the Supreme Council of Crimea adopted a declaration on the state sovereignty of the peninsula, again as part of Ukraine. And during the referendum on the Declaration of Independence of Ukraine, 54% of the votes were in support of this. Despite the preponderance of votes, this was the lowest result in all regions of Ukraine. After the independence of Ukraine, Crimea remained part of it. What did Russia think about this in 1991? During the collapse of the Soviet Union, the countries of the Soviet Union agreed that the borders of the newly formed states would remain within the Soviet republics. This approach was supposed to ensure that there would be no wars and disagreements between the countries over the ownership of land. Also, of course, they eventually arose anyway. Therefore, no one initially claimed Crimea either. Later, Russia will confirm the territorial integrity of Ukraine more than once with a number of agreements. During the signing of the agreements on the establishment of the Commonwealth of Independent States, the countries pledged to recognize and respect each other's territorial integrity. And later, in the 1904 Budapest Memorandum, when Ukraine renounced nuclear weapons, Russia became one of the guarantors of territorial integrity. Nevertheless, already in the early 90s, the first separatist movements appeared in Crimea, and some Russian politicians began to support such aspirations. In 1992, Crimea was renamed the Republic of Crimea and adopted its own constitution. Then the Republic received extremely broad powers, and Parliament and the post of President appeared. And the problem started already at this stage. Ukraine, not being a federation, could not have a republic in its composition, so Crimea soon acquired the name of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. In the same year, there were also plans to hold a referendum asking about the independence of Crimea, but it was cancelled. During this period, the growth of separatism began. In the region in 1994, the Russian bloc led by Yuri Mishkov, who became president of the republic, won the elections. The bloc proposed to separate from Ukraine and gain independence. However, at the same time, it assumed close integration with Russia, obtaining Russian citizenship by residence and entering the rubble zone. In this regard, the Ukrainian authorities decided to act quite decisively and stop such intentions. In 1995, they abolished the 1992 Crimean Constitution, which assumed broad powers of the peninsula, and instead they adopted a new constitution in Crimea without the post of president and without broad sovereignty. Also, pro-Ukrainian forces soon will come to power in Crimea, and the topic of separatism will leave the Crimean agenda, and pro-Russian forces will no longer be able to take over a significant electorate. In 1992, the Supreme Soviet of Russia recognized the decision of the Presidium of Soviet Russia on the transfer of Crimea in 1954 as an illegal act, but this was not followed by any reactions. Also, the adoption of the resolution of the Supreme Council of 1993 was a high-profile case, when they recognized Sevastopol as a de facto Russian city. However, Yeltsin then opposed such statements, condemning the actions of the parliament and said that it's not necessary to start a war with Ukraine. Soon the Supreme Soviet of the Russian Federation will be liquidated altogether during the political crisis of 1993. The topic of Crimea in those years, of course, was reflected in the agenda of some politicians, but apart from the above mentioned cases, it did not reach such a high level. The only thing that really worried Russia at that time was its Black Sea fleet in the Crimea, which almost led to war between the countries. However, this issue was resolved. In 1994, the countries signed an agreement on the regulation of the problem, and in 1997, Ukraine allowed the stay of the Russian fleet and military in the Crimea. As we can see, despite attempts to revive the transfer of Crimea to Ukraine in 1954, and the promotion of various concepts of the future of Crimea, the peninsula remained part of Ukraine after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Russian authorities in those years did not claim Crimea, and even repeatedly confirmed the territorial integrity of Ukraine together with Crimea.